So the one who is organizing this talk has told me that it's enough to say that you are welcome to the intersectionality series of talks. So that's it. That's all I have to say about intersectionality. Have a lot to say about fellow primate Ishika though, and for that I will refer to my notes shamelessly. So Ishika has a bachelor's degree in the life sciences from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, and a master's degree in wildlife biology and conservation from NCBS. She is currently a PhD student at the Center for Wildlife Studies, India. And for the past 4 years, her research has focused on human non-human primate relationships. Initially, she has worked in the Nicobar Islands, and currently she works in northeastern India. And she has a super popular podcast. I think she's the best wildlife quizzer ever. I couldn't answer half of the questions because she would just, show one digit of some animal and say which animal is this. So I couldn't figure out what they were. Oh, clearly, I mean, yeah, I need to learn the tricks from you. And she also, apart from engaging in meaningful, insightful research, she intends to continue working on avenues in science communication. That includes children's books, producing, well, podcasts I've already mentioned, and experimenting with a range of popular media, particularly within primatology. So with that, I'm going to say coo.
Thanks so much, Ashmita. And hi, everyone. I'm really sorry that it got late. It just took a while to cross Kodigihali signal because of one big procession. It's just copying still. But I'm just very excited to be here. I think the intersectionality series is sounds so fantastic. I've been seeing all of the other talks that's happening, so I'm very touched and honored to be a part of it. And there were a lot of ideas that we had discussed, and hopefully maybe in the future. Today I'll be talking a little bit more about how I've kind of serendipitously ended up in a transdisciplinary space within the primatology arena. And hopefully, we can have some discussions which are a little more reflective about what it means to study human nature relationships, where culture comes into it, where history and politics comes into it, where caste comes into it, and also very importantly, where the non-human and more than human perspective comes into it, because as much as we dig in and study about human nature, culture, relationships, we very often forget to talk through the lens of the non human entity. And humans are often just one of so many. Yeah. So I want to start the talk today, not by I want to basically lend some time for you to hear the voices of some of my key collaborators where I work currently in Assam. So once the slide is up, we'll hear from them. Okay. So this actually has the faces of some of my most keen collaborators, starting with three amazing Western Hoolock Gibbons, Kalia, Rongi, and Twig, who you saw singing in the first frame. That's Jui the dog, and that's Mohit Khura, my key collaborator, who's also an amazing local conservationist over there. And that's Hemonti Khuri in the background, who very clearly predicted on this day that, oh, the Gibbons are about to sing, and 2 minutes later they started. So with this context, and just to know that there are so many voices to listen to, I'm going to just talk a little bit about how I ended up here. And this quote is something that I love to start with very often because I think it so nicely captures what I've been trying to do without realizing I've been trying to do that. So this was a friend of mine from the island, from Assam, Pobitro, who said, "We never needed an alarm growing up. Even when the jungle was dense and we couldn't see the gibbons, we heard them like clockwork every morning. When we heard their loud songs and cries in the morning, we knew it was time to get ready and to go to school. This is what our childhood was like, and this is why we know the songs of the gibbons so well. And then, as time passed, all the jungle was lost and we started being able to see them. Now, there are very few of them left, and they come very close to us. And both of our lives have changed a lot. And I think that last line actually says a lot because we as a research community very often forget to think about how the lives of the non-human entity have also changed in addition to land use and many other things, but it comes very naturally to those who actually spend their days with them. Sorry. So through a lot of these things I started to ask myself, what is it about a monkey that really gets people so emotional, so what makes them play around with logic and sentiment so much. And this first started cropping up, like Ashmita was saying, I had the pleasure of working in the Nicobar Islands with the Nicobar long-tailed macaque when I was at NCBS and a little while after. And now I continue to engage with them in many different ways and I miss them dearly. But they taught me so much about what it's like to go beyond just ecology and to get over myself as a researcher and realize that I'm really a nobody when there's so much else happening in the system. And this is a compilation of a lot of different things that while I was working in the Nicobar Islands, I heard from many different people. And I'm guessing most of you here should be able to understand the Hindi translation, the original Hindi, because the translation really doesn't do it justice. But in any case, it's there on the next line. So I used to hear things like, ट्रक भर के आते हैं, इतने नन्हे और प्यारे हैं, हमारा पूरी खेती का नाश करते हैं, अपने बच्चे का बहुत ख्याल रखते हैं, इनके आंखें एकदम हमारे जैसे हैं, भगवान के समान होते हैं, एकदम होशियार और चालाक है, कभी कभी बदतमीजी करते हैं. This was in relation to a story that I heard many, many times on the island in many different tellings. इनमें लालच तो बहुत है, मेरे परिवार जैसे ही है, डेगची उठाकर भाग जाते हैं, दिल देखकर थोड़ा दिल पिघल जाता है. And you can see here there's like a whole range of emotions that people are expressing. And what was very fascinating to me is that many of these things were said by the same person. So it's not like one person said कि दिल पिघल जाता है and another person said that सब कुछ नाश कर देते हैं. It was often the same person talking about the same monkey in different contexts. And so that also led me to do a slightly different kind of analysis a little while after I returned from Nicobar to understand what is driving the fact that people are talking about monkeys in these different ways and often simultaneously. Why is it that somebody who loves them also hates them? And it was starting to become very clear that nothing was black and white when it came to human and non-human primate interactions. And so I got to work on this book chapter, which I'd be happy to share with any of you who are interested later, where we looked at the concept of affect. And when you're talking about affect, it basically means what is your learned instinct. In this moment, if a monkey came in front of me and I instinctively acted upon it, is it because that is in my DNA, or is it accumulation of all of my life's experiences leading up to this moment that tells me how I should act with this monkey right now? Right? So we were looking at how affect and emotion can form these geographies that people and other natural elements kind of use. And we used a lot of the interviews and conversations that I had in the Nicobar Islands to look at that. And what we saw is ethos, pathos, and logos were three kind of categories of drivers that we could isolate. Ethos being the overall rules and authorities by which we live. So this could be religion, it could be government law, it could be our Wildlife Protection Act, it could be what our household rules are. If my father says I must not harm a living being, I will not harm a living being. And so those are the rules you live by willingly or unwillingly. Then there's pathos, which is your sentiment, it's your emotion, and that's often the strongest one of the three, and very often can be seen overwriting ethos and logos. And that's also when you read a quote or a transcript and you say, this doesn't make logical sense. And very often it might be because pathos is overpowering in that context. And logos is the logic and reasoning that people use to reach certain decisions and opinions. So just to give you a couple of examples, under ethos, this was one of the quotes that we found really interesting. So Vasanti had said, these are really large monkeys. They would come right in front of me sometimes as though saying, if you cause harm to us, we're going to bite you badly. But now I've started praying to Hanuman so much that they could never harm me. Ever since I've been devoted to Hanuman, nothing untoward has happened to me. And I'm sure nothing bad will happen in the future either. And while this is a very beautiful thought and it's something that she's deriving a lot of faith and comfort from, it's also a double edged sword, because what happens if tomorrow a monkey does indeed interact with her in a way that is harmful to her? Does that mean she loses faith in her religion or in the monkeys or both? Right? So these are also very interesting um, aspects to engage with. Under sentiment, also, we saw this was an extremely huge range of things that came up here. But one quick example is that of Sita, who said, small monkeys that cling to their mothers are also seen. Sometimes, if the young monkeys are left behind, the group will come back for them. I have seen this in my old house. 4 to 5 dogs went after a young monkey, but the whole group came and saved it. And it felt good to see that. And I heard this a lot from many different people. And we also saw how, depending on who they were, what their gender was, what their own responsibilities were socially, whether it was in their household, whether it was professionally, when they saw the troops of monkeys kind of engaging with the same kinds of responsibilities and responses, they related to it extremely closely and drew comfort from it. And then there was also a lot of fantastic, logical reasoning that came in through a lot of the conversations I had with people. For example, Kumaraswamy, who said people are now beginning to explore newer worlds and avenues. If people can achieve so much, why wouldn't the monkeys make progress of their own too? We are people with desires. If we want to taste and eat fruits that come from America or China, why won't the monkeys want to taste new things as well? And this emerged in a conversation which was extremely intense. We were talking about a huge amount of crop loss that this person had faced because of two troops of macaques. And they were telling me about how they had lost upwards of 60,000 rupees in revenue because of this loss. And that was very heavy for them because they were the sole earner and it was a large family. But still, this was the reasoning at the end of it, where they understood the fact that, yes, I'm growing exciting new things which they may not be getting in some of the other patches of natural habitat which they have outside of my farm. So I can understand why they want to come here and eat it. And they then went on to explain that the onus of protecting their crop fields lied with them. And so there were a lot of these interesting things. And I'll tell you, it's not on my slide, but there was one more very interesting example which had come up. Um, so, in relation to the ethos part of it with Hanuman, there was one lady who brought up the fact that yes, Hanuman exists and we're not supposed to harm Hanuman, and the monkeys are supposed to be descendants of Hanuman. But then she also went on to say, but I've seen these monkeys eat anda, they eat egg. And Hanuman, she's like, should vegetarian, should not have anything. And this one is very little bit black in color, so I don't think this one is Hanuman. So it's okay, I'll throw stones at them once in a while. So there are a lot of these interesting intersections of these buckets also. And since today we are on the topic of intersectionality, I also wanted to highlight this. I know it's a very long quote, so I'll read through it slowly. But this was something that emerged that I got to do in collaboration with Maria, who is just part of the graduating batch of NCBS. And she did a very similar project with the golden langurs and people in lower Assam. And this was a quote that came out. And when both of us were sitting with this, we had goosebumps. And there's just so much to unpack here. So this was from a member of the Adivasi community there who said, the Adivasis live near the forest. The monkeys should have entered our homes, but they never did. Look at the other villages. The monkeys cause so much destruction there. People say you live so close to the forest, yet they don't enter your homes, but they take our vegetables. The people of the forest, which is the forest department here, don't harm animals and protect the forests. Consequently, the monkeys don't cause much damage to us. However, people from other villages harm the forest extensively. They come with trucks and cut down trees. Once I told them, you look down on us Adivasis and think yourself superior. If we were to enter your house, you'd clean everything meticulously. But now, the monkeys enter your house, eat, defecate, and leave, and you can't do anything about it. How is it that the monkeys don't bother the lower caste? This is why one should not make distinctions based on religion or caste. And very often, when we are having conversations around caste, when we are working with human nature relationships, it is the more than human entity that evokes a lot of this reasoning and these very loud political voices when we are talking. And it brings out a lot of themes which may not directly be related to the ecology or behavior of a species, but can tell you a lot even about the human condition. So, of course, once you go through all of this, when I was at NCBS initially, now in the last few batches after I graduated, there's been a lot more conversation around coexistence and bringing in the social sciences and interdisciplinarity. But at the time when I was there, we didn't have any such training. And I was trained to go looking for conflict. When I went there saying I want to work on human macaque relationships, everyone asked me, okay, so is there conflict? And if there isn't, what is the point of going all the way to Nicobar to study this? But after getting to know all of this, these were all the questions that were going on in my head. What is conflict? What is coexistence? And what is this monkey menace that we can't stop talking about in our country? And is it actually something in between? Is it a mixture of all of these different things? Because all of these different emotions were coming out, and these are actually the tags from some of my social science analysis, and you can see the sheer spectrum of emotion that comes out in the conversations I have with people. So what I realized is essentially the root cause of the problem is in most of the literature around human nature relationships centers the human being. And everything is through the lens and through the eyes of a person. When in reality, when you're talking about interactions, while human beings still have a disproportionately larger impact and influence on their environments and ecosystems, they are still only one of many different players. And we need to look at the lenses of many different beings and entities in order to actually understand what is going on here. And so I kept coming back to it. What is it about a monkey? Anyone I spoke to, especially in India or South Asia, if you talk about, if I say I work with macaques or monkeys, immediately they'll say, Are, this happened to me once. Or, oh, they're such a nuisance. Or, oh my God, they're so cute. I never met somebody who didn't have an opinion about a monkey. So what is it about them? And I think if you look at it slightly more academically, one is, of course, they are human like and we are monkey like, because we're all primates and we are kin and we're all highly adaptable. So as we have rapid land use changes, as we can adapt to new conditions, they can as well. We also have a lot of feeding of primates that goes on in our country, often linked to its cultural significance. And the fact that these are also extremely intelligent beings definitely makes mitigation measures and interactions and long-term relationships particularly complex. And so, in a country which is multicultural and which houses a great number of primate species, what was starting to become clear is that these non-human beings are undeniable participants in the initiation, propagation, and maintenance of the shared worlds that they are having with people. It's not just people always, or just the mere existence of them, but very often the more than human are initiating these interactions and helping maintain the bonds between everybody. So, this is the question that I asked in a way during my master's days, and I continue to ask now even in my PhD, where I'm looking at what are the natures and extents of these relationships in landscapes like India. And so we have a huge diversity of primates in the country, and this is just two-thirds of them on the screen right now, and half of this diversity lies in the northeast of India. And that yellow dot on the screen is where I work currently in Upper Assam. It's a small cluster of 21 villages called Barekuri. And just in that vicinity around where I work, if I can, include the forest patches nearby, there are several human communities who are indigenous to the land and also some settler communities in the area, along with all of these different species. So there's the Western Hoolock Gibbon, rhesus macaques, pigtail macaques, Assamese macaques, capped langurs, and also the slow loris. And so this is what I've been focusing on for the last 4 years. We've also done a lot of work with the macaques and langurs, but I'm going to talk about this today largely. And so that's Rongi on the left and Kalia on the right. And these were the first two gibbons that I had the pleasure of learning about, getting to know, forming a bond with myself. And they are the ones who basically taught me what it's like to be a gibbon and how what it's like to study a gibbon. So these are the Western Hoolock gibbons of Barekuri. Currently, there are only 20 individuals in this area, of which only 4 of them are adult females. There are a bunch of young ones, but gibbons are long-lived species. The oldest gibbon that we know of in Barekuri was 43 years old, and we know this because of how closely people keep track of them. And so, through a series of interviews and correlations, we were able to calculate how old he was. And so, these are my first collaborators, and second is the Assamese Moran community of the area, which is the people who inhabit these villages where I work and who also live in close proximity with the Gibbons. And so, under this, I mainly had, I'm going to talk about these two objectives. First is Gibbon's responses to people, where I'm just trying to understand what are the species specific other than human primate, ecologies, and how does that affect how they interact with people. And also looking at vice versa. When it comes to human communities, how does their socio-cultural variability affect the relationships that they share with people? So I was looking at these two objectives primarily. And while it's nice to put them, tease them apart to write it out as objectives, the methods to actually get to this is very mixed, and they mingle with each other, and it's hard to often tease apart. And so I used a lot of interdisciplinarity and mixed methods where I was doing both qualitative and quantitative work here. And this is actually the primary relationship that formed 15 years ago, and I'll get to the context of why in a little bit. That's Hemonti Khuri on the screen, and that's Kalia. And the people here, most of the people, have learned over time to feed the gibbons bananas. And this first happened when the forest was completely lost in the area, and this population kind of got trapped with the people here with very little foliage and fruit and food. And that's why people wanted to start engaging with them. And it took about 15 years for the gibbons to get this comfortable to people and actually come down and accept bananas. But they don't do this with everybody. They have one to one bonds with people, and they comfortably accept bananas from certain people and at certain times. So, this is one such situation where Kalia was coming comfortably to accept a banana from Kuri. And so the work involved many long interviews and follow up conversations and oral history documentation, and overall a lot of ethnographic work with the people of Barekuri. And in addition to that, there was an attempt to not just do the traditional means of looking at animal behavior, where we do group scans and focal samples, where we don't always get enough context for why an animal is behaving a certain way, but actually to do ethnographic research on a more than human, where we can I wanted to understand the lived experience of the gibbons, right, without missing anything, without losing certain amount bits of context to why they did something in a certain moment. And so in the same way in which we would collect stories from people verbally, although the gibbons couldn't speak with us, the notes are field notes, running notes that were collected in a very structured way. So, on any particular given day, from morning to night or evening, actually, for the gibbons, I would follow a single individual through the day and note down minute to minute everything that was transpiring between them, which would also include information about weather, the landscape, where they're sitting, where they're moving, GPS information, their interactions with the others in their family, and interactions with people as well, and generally events around them, so including sounds, human activity in the area, to understand not only when they were responding to something, but when something was happening and they were not responding to it, because that can also be an important sign of longer term habituation when it occurs in these kind of places. So under this question of understanding co-constructed life worlds, like I was saying, these are very closely I consider collaborators in this work, without whose consent and willingness any of this information could have been gathered. So that's Rongi again with Puali, their second child, and Kura again the bike here, and that's Luja Guju, who has been working on this project with me, and we've been kind of creating the study design and doing all of the data collection for this together. This is a brief overview of the methods that I've used, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. I've already told you a little bit. And so, for those of you who are familiar with gibbons, you would imagine them living in a lot of these large dipterocarp, ribbed tropical rainforests where you have to really crane your neck, 50 feet up into the canopy to see them. But this is the landscape where they currently live. And it's such a dissonance. And it took me a good year to even get used to seeing a gibbon in this landscape, even though I was seeing them every day. And the reason for this, like I was saying, is that just about 30 years ago, there was actually pretty dense forests in this area. Some of you might be familiar with the Alpha anti-military groups, which were also pretty violent in Assam, and this was a place which was a hotbed for this activity. And a lot of my collaborators are also now what's called Salfa or surrendered Alpha, and them and their children and grandchildren continue to live in this area. And the reason why this community first came and settled over here was because of the forest cover, because they could stay safe um, from the military and the army and other governing forces in the area. But as that stopped becoming a primary source of what they did, and they started moving on to alternate livelihood sources, a lot of the people in this area were unfortunately captured, and they were forced to shift to other forms of livelihood. There was a lot of plantation that came in, so monocultures were introduced around the turn of the century, and there was initially a lot of orange and guava plantations, and so there was still some canopy, although the diversity of trees were lost. But more recently, because of issues with soil quality, given the sudden destruction and felling of trees, the oranges were not being very productive, and so most of the places have now completely shifted to tea plantations, and they've also received a lot of government subsidies to do this. And so it became lucrative on many fronts to convert their plantations to mini tea gardens. So even if someone had 1 acre of land, they now have a 1 acre tea garden. And so whatever little canopy was there is also lost. And in addition to that, there was concretization. There's a lot of oil mining in the area, which is problematic, and electrification with continued logging in this area. So we're seeing, even in the 4 years that I have been there, there's been constant land use change. And we've been also working with hand drawn maps. And even now, every 2 to 3 months, we move around elements because things are changing extremely rapidly. So um, this is a patch in one of our collaborators' homes, Olibda, and this is his garden. He and his father have been caretakers of the gibbons for over 4 decades now, and they have chosen to maintain some of the trees in their garden and not get rid of everything in the tea garden. So their production is actually a little lower because of it, because tea loves sun and you're not supposed to have as many shade trees, but they have retained it because they do look after the gibbons very closely. So, through all of this, what we've seen is a very interesting range of interactions between gibbons and people. And what you can see highlighted in red boxes here are things that we've seen on both fronts, for the gibbons as well, for the people as well, where they communicate with each other. Like Rashmita said, "Ku" to me at the start of this, which is, that seminary work that Rana had done, where they looked at how this was developed specifically to communicate with humans. There is something that we've observed here as well, where there is a particular call that the gibbons use when they're talking to people as well. And we're just in the process of doing a little bit of acoustic work and analysis to see if it is indeed a separate call, which they do not use amongst themselves, which was initially derived from what could have been a threat call or an alarm call, which has now led to the co-opting of that call to communicate with people and request bananas or simply to say, hey, I have arrived. So we are also seeing some interesting communication here. People talk to the gibbons. They've given names to the gibbons. Some of the people who interact with them extremely closely, like Mohit Khura, have named them and speak to them so much that the gibbons even know their names, to the extent where if he says Rongi A, only Rongi will come, right? So there's a lot of interesting, interaction and communication happening there. Both of them have mutual curiosity for each other, and they spend a lot of time observing and understanding each other. There's recognition between them. There are trust bonds that are formed, which are very clearly not towards general humans or but to a particular one. And also it goes towards the gibbons. So for example, one of the families we were studying, There was an adult male, female, and an offspring, but another male had entered the area, and people knew how to distinguish between the two males, and definitely had more empathy for the male that was already there, and were very concerned about the intentions of the new male that came into the area. So there's a lot of that happening. And there's also some other stuff that people do, like gossiping about the gibbons. They like to know kisne kisse shaadi kiya, kiska bacha hone wala hai, is this one pregnant or not? And it's actually part of very active conversation. They just chat about it casually, like how they take each other ka khabar, you know. It's a huge part of what is becoming the Barekuri culture over time. Um, so this is actually an excerpt from the very first day when I went to visit Barekuri and speak to Mohit Khura. And this is what I had put down that day in my book. Um, so I said, pulling my mind back to the events of Mohit Uncle's interview, which was simply mind blowing. He clearly has a deep love for the gibbons, and his eyes light up when he talks about them. He knows the individuals around here very closely, has followed their lineages, migrations, and pairings for 20 years. Then, towards the end of all my questions and following some hollering across two houses, he picked up three plump bananas and set off full speed out the gate and onto the little path connecting all the houses on his stretch. He asked me to stay put for a moment while he did his thing. After after staying up on the staring up into the tamil trees for a few minutes with building anticipation, he called out to me, "Ishika!" And away I went equally fast to find him standing about 100 meters away with his arm outstretched with bananas towards a black blob sitting hunched over an electrical cable. Within a couple of seconds, I saw the adult male Kalia and his wife, Rongi, and they saw me too. Uncle mentioned that, okay, so that goes on, but I really enjoyed going back to these notes after about 3 years of working there, because I wrote this and never looked at it again. And I realized that there were so many themes which I had over time systematically done through proper scientific method, but a lot of those emergent themes were already here on my very first encounter with both Khura and Kalia, who went on to be the key members of this entire work. And just the sheer love and mutual respect that they had for each other kind of became evident on day one itself. And so the reasons for why people have such strong positive bonds with the gibbons here, like the reasons are very multifaceted. Some of it is just the behavior of the gibbons themselves, the kind of ecology that they have. People enjoy watching them a lot. There's a lot of observation and happiness and well-being that comes of just seeing them do their thing. There's also a lot of anthropomorphism that occurs here, and undeniably so. It's also, they're very much like us in many different ways. They also live in nuclear families and have pair bonds. They're known to be serially monogamous, although for some reasons we're also starting to question whether that's the general rule. But, in general, that's what we see with gibbons across Southeast Asia. They also have a lot of compassion and empathy for what they're going through. They have a lot of stories about how they have had been dealing with the land use changes in the area as well. Another big reason for why people like the gibbons, which was also a part of one of the objectives of my PhD, was their comparison to other primates. So I was curious to see how people relate to gibbons versus langurs versus macaques versus lorises, and they do relate extremely closely and often mostly positively with the gibbons. And the moment you bring a macaque into the picture, they'll say, even if they don't have a clear reason for why they like gibbons, they'll say we like them because they're not like the macaques. And often that is also enough for them because they don't like the macaques very much. Or even if they do, they remember the nuisance before the reasons for why they like them. So in fact, even if you accidentally call the gibbons bandar instead of holo in this landscape, some people will take offense on the part of the gibbon and say, "नहीं नहीं नहीं, ये बंदर नहीं है, holo है." So it's very different here. Um, this is Khura again, and this is again a picture from that first day I was chatting with him. And very quickly, while we were talking, because we must have spoken for about 3.5 hours at a stretch that day, with the gibbons coming and going in the middle, and I'd already seen he had lit up 3 4 cigarettes and he was smoking. He's as through the day, whenever he's not doing something else, he's smoking. And then I also, again with my usual training of wondering what is the economic cost of relationships and stuff like that, again, he completely put me in my place. So I asked him about that, because he said he was feeding the gibbons regularly. So I asked him how much it costs him. And he says, what is the expense? I smoke every day. I must be smoking up to 10 cigarettes when it comes to, say, 100 rupees. If I just smoke one less, then I can use that 10 rupees to get bananas for them and their stomachs get filled. How much banana will they eat? They'll just take one or two. So here, for one, he'd completely dismissed my inclusion of economics into this because he has already done his own internal calculation. And then in the subsequent years, I discovered he's the most incredibly resourceful person when it comes to bananas. He's the foremost expert on who grows what bananas, whether they use pesticides or not. He's extremely particular about there being no dawai wala bananas. It has to be fully organic bananas. He knows the different kinds and varieties, who uses what kind of medicine, what is organic, what isn't, from within the village and from the nearby town in the bazaar. He knows which vendors to go to for organic bananas, which ones don't get sold that he can get for cheap. So he's done all of this homework on his own and nicely spread this information. So he tells others also, if you're buying bananas for the gibbons, you get it from here. And he also knows when the bananas are going to ripen in whose house, and he'll go and take it from them in time to feed the bananas. So he plans it in a week in advance. So it's very interesting. And in the process has also completely shattered my black and white understanding of you must not feed wildlife. Because while I still agree with that, and please never feed wildlife, and I still haven't fed any of the gibbons in this area, even though I've lived here and with them for so long, um, I think it's made me rethink this blanket notion that it is bad completely, because what I have seen is that feeding has resulted in a range of positivity in this landscape and has become actually the sole cause of the reason why gibbons are continuing to survive in this landscape. And so now we are trying to find different ways in which people can replace feeding with other interactions with the gibbons, so that they're not still feeding the gibbons every day. But we have come to realize that had feeding not existed at any time, there would probably be no gibbons here at all. And so we are now in the process of trying to stop feeding, minimize feeding, and definitely make sure that nobody who is not from the village feeds the gibbons. And so that is definitely still very much part of the work that we're doing. But I think there's a lot more to think about when it comes to that and the implications of feeding. Um, Absolutely love this picture. That's Rongi. And you saw I mentioned Puali a bit little while ago, who was black in color at the time. This is her when she was just born. This is about 3 weeks old. And the reason I put this picture up here is to just bring back the other than human ethnographies for a moment, to tell you that just being able to observe them in a framework which is not just a regimented group scan, where I don't take into consideration what happens in the interim of 15 minutes between scans. I was able to document some of the most incredible insights of what happens when a new baby is born. And that includes this observation where moments after, not moments, maybe a couple of hours after she had given birth, Rangi was still, taking out placenta and afterbirth, cleaning herself, consuming parts of it, cleaning the baby. And we were able to be privy to a lot of these detailed observations, which as much as I tried, I couldn't find other documentation of it in the literature or even some of the gray literature out there. And the fact that we had been spending that kind of time with them also meant that they trusted us enough to be a part of this experience that they were going through. We've also documented some amazing folklore in the area. I can tell you one of the stories. So there's a story of how there was a human family of four: a mother, father, a brother, and a sister. And while the brother was like Raja Beta, they loved him to bits. Whatever he did, he couldn't do anything wrong. And the girl had a lot of issues. She liked to be outdoorsy, she liked to be outside, she didn't want to do conventional things. And and her family just disliked her. While she had a good relationship with her brother, her parents and she fought continuously and all the time. And on one particular day, she had an awful, awful, awful fight with her father. And then she ran away to the back of her house. And they had a pukuri there, which is a little pond. And she used to enjoy just sitting there in general. Every time she was down, she would sit there and watch this one gibbon play in the back around the forest. And that used to calm her down. And on this particular day, when she had this horrible fight with her father, she decided enough is enough. And then she ran away to go find the gibbon. And then when her brother realized what had happened, he went after her and ran away. He knew that she would be somewhere near the pukuri. And then what he saw was her climbing up into the trees and going away with this gibbon, who was completely black in color. And while he wanted so much to call her back, he knew how unhappy she was at home. So he said, you know what, it's okay, let her go. She'll be happier there. And so what he did was he took off his gamusa, which he was wearing, and he threw it up to the male gibbon. And he said, here. And he gave it to him as a sign of respect, trust, and also as bestowing some responsibility, saying, keep my sister safe. And so the gibbon took it, accepted it from him, and tied it around his head. And people say that that is what caused the white eyebrows in the gibbons. And this is also the reason why the female is skin colored like people and brownish. And so this is one of many, many, many folklore that we've collected in the area that explains why gibbons are how they are, look how they are, do what they do. So this is a picture from International Gibbon Day celebrations in the village. And I think the children are honestly the best part of this entire celebration. But when you zoom out a little bit and try to see what is happening over here, um, it's pretty dicey because it's deeply political. And this year, especially so. So it was always basically a photo op for a lot of local conservationists and politicians and stakeholders, including oil mining companies, to come in and say, hey, we are conserving the gibbons and they're important. And it often included massive megaphones and speakers right in the middle of gibbon territory, and you wouldn't see the gibbons for 3 days. So it's very counterproductive, actually. The children really rise to the occasion, though, and do some lovely things for the gibbons and enact different things that the gibbons do. And that's the one nice, pleasant part of it. This year, some of you might be aware, our Prime Minister said some things about the gibbons of Barekuri and said that, oh, the people here are doing a great job conserving them, which has given a lot of hope to the community here. And Assam's Chief Minister came for the celebrations just yesterday because yesterday was Gibbon Day. And so all of that happened, and it's going to be, I think, a little challenging because I know a lot of my collaborators are now filled with a lot of hope in the belief that this is now a national priority. And as a lot of us know how these things play out, very often these are just things to be said and may not actually translate into any real support on the ground from the government. So I'll be heading back to the field in November, and I'm curious to see how this will play out and what it actually means for the gibbons and people of Barekuri that the government has kind of got a light on this area now. Um, I've told you some lovely things about Kalia, but unfortunately, we lost him in September last year to natural causes. He was the gibbon I was telling you. We know to have lived to about 40 to 43 years old, and which also brings me to the fact that people are so culturally linked to the gibbons in this area, even though it is not prescribed in their religion, which is also something which, I think we should also note, where culture and religion don't always go hand in hand, and doesn't mean that if there is a cultural practice it is linked to religion or religious texts. So in this area, when a gibbon passes away, funerals are observed, and so they are cremated. People mourn their loss, they come together, they talk about the gibbons, and they share stories about them. And people also sometimes hold fasts in the same way they do to mourn a person. And what we also observed was in Kalia's family, this is the family, that's Kalia on the left, Rongi, that's an even younger baby there, and that's Twig. After Kalia's passing, we've been observing a lot of altered behaviors in the rest of the family as well. And we've seen their home range shrink a little bit. They don't travel as much as they do. They stay very close to Mohit Khura's house, and that's become a safe space and a safe zone for them. Uh, the amount of time spent in general leisure activities like play has drastically declined, and there are a lot more vigilant behaviors. And some of this can be a consequence of Rongi now having to also take on the role of vigilance and looking after the family single handedly. But looking at the altered behaviors and a lot of the stories from the people, it makes you wonder whether we need to take a long, hard look at what grief and mourning looks like in the lives of gibbons when they lose one another. And Rongi and Kalia were a mated pair for at least 35 years. This is Hemanti Khuri again, and this is something she said to me as soon as uh, I reached Assam, hearing of Kalia's passing. And she said, "I want to cry when I look at Rongi now. Also Twig and Gelsi. They seem lonely and sad. With my own heart troubles, I sometimes think and pray that it would have been better had I been taken instead of Kalia, so that he could have continued living his happy life for some more days, being healthy." And when she said this last year, it was so hard hitting because she is my host mother. She's the one who looked after me like a daughter for the last, since 2020. And unfortunately, we also lost her this year very suddenly to the heart troubles that she was telling me about back then. But just knowing that somebody could have such a close bond with a gibbon that they would say, "Take me instead," you know, is something that just gives me chills. This is the funeral pyre of one of the gibbons that we lost in the area, not Kalia's. This was another one called Kola Singh, fondly by a couple of people in another village. Um, so this area has also seen a lot of, as I was saying, there's a lot of oil mining that's happened in this area. Sorry, the slide has come, I think, a little prematurely, but since it's here anyway. So in 2020, there was an oil blast in the Bagjan Reserve Forest. I'm not sure how many people here know about it. Uh, and I think it's actually unfortunate because not a lot of this news makes it to mainstream media and news in the southern peninsula of the country. uh, but what happened here was really drastic. It was a massive oil blast which led to a fire that raged on for 3 months, and in that duration we lost a humongous amount of biodiversity of every taxa imaginable. It was directly linked to the Maguri Beal wetland area, which was in turn connected and is in turn connected to the entire area where I work. And we unfortunately lost one pregnant female gibbon to this oil blast. And so there are a lot of very active threats that the gibbons face in this landscape. Along with the changing, you know, structure and land use in this region, people have also been seen changing their beliefs a little bit. So, very often when I would talk to people about the beliefs and other stories related to gibbons, one thing that would come up a lot is if you see a gibbon on the ground, it's bad luck. Something bad is going to happen. And that was the standard belief. Or some people would also say if you see a gibbon on the ground, you're going to fall terribly sick. But then a lot of people also started telling me this. They said the gibbons have seen this landscape change. They've seen them watch the trees being cut, grieving for their forest. How are they supposed to raise young in this environment? We used to believe that seeing a gibbon on the ground brought misfortune to the witness, but now walking across the ground is their best option. Why wouldn't they choose it? If there were enough trees, they would have used them. But now they have to make tough decisions and risky decisions to survive. And so, because people also know the reason why gibbons are on the ground now, a lot of people don't actively have that belief anymore. They say, huh, people used to say that it's a bad luck, but now what else can they do? So maybe it's not actually bad luck. Like we know why it's happening. And the reason why this folklore and this belief actually existed could be linked to the fact that these are arboreal creatures. And if they were to be on the ground, something terrible may have happened for them to actually be on the ground. This is just a short clip from our Gibbon ethnographies from September 23 to show you what walking on the ground kind of looks like. That's Kalia, who's probably one of the most agile gibbons that I've known. So he was able to make it swiftly across. You can see the timestamp 10:13 to 10:44, but it only took him like 2 seconds to cross. But the reason for this huge half an hour gap in time is that they are actually very slow on the ground. I could outrun them, and I really don't run fast. And they're not built for the ground. That was Twick who went after, and you could have seen he took a little bit more time. So they spent about 30 minutes almost in just vigilance, in making sure it was safe and threat free to come onto the ground and make that tiny crossing. So it also takes up a lot of time in their day to navigate the landscape given the lack of canopy in many areas. Some other things that people have said, which I think are very interesting in terms of understanding the intentionality of gibbons and the agency of gibbons and what things might be through the lens of the gibbons, is that they are deeply intelligent and know our behavior as well too. They know who is good, they know who is bad, but at the same time they can be naughty, not like the monkeys who harass us, nothing like that, but to have fun, to make us laugh, maybe to make each other laugh. And I like this quote a lot because while they're talking about the intelligence, they kind of got carried away to talk about just what they intend to do with each other. And it is very much like how we might talk about each other or a friend of ours. And very often, even when I am here and I call and speak to my local collaborators there, in the same breath as they will tell me what their son is up to, what their wife is up to. They'll tell me what Kalia is up to, what Kava is up to, Anu is up to. And so, if it was someone who didn't know that we were talking about gibbons, they would genuinely not know we were talking about gibbons because they really talk about them as though they are humans. So, it really makes you think what is the species barrier there and where do we, draw that line between human and non human. I'm also now showing you a couple of clips from the Gibbon behavior work that we've been doing, which I think very interestingly highlights what could be signs of Gibbon agency through the eyes of the Gibbon themselves. And also, so okay, oops, sorry. Okay, so just to give you a bit of explanation here. So this lady, she's feeding the gibbons, and then she went around the tea garden to find them. And she was also kind of playing around this day. This was in another village called Torajan. So there are two gibbons in this video. Bonzo, who is a 4-year-old female, who's not yet hit maturity, and her father Kawa. So you can see here she's teasing Bonzo with the banana. So she wants to hand it over, but she's like, come and take it, and not giving it cleanly. So Kawa jumps over to her, and what he did was he yanked her hair.
वो भी करने वाला
And taking inspiration from Kawa, Bonzo teased her too. But she laughed it off and walked away. And I think what's really interesting here is that the hair pulling is something that they do with each other a lot. So very often you'll see if one of the kids is harassing one of the parents, saying, come play with me, and they're doing something else, or they're foraging, or they're trying to rest, and they're getting annoyed with the baby, they'll do the hair pulling for them as well as a sign of just stop it. Right? And that's what he did to her, even though she's a human. And I think this is also one of the things which makes it very interesting when you combine it with the fact that it took 15 years for people to habituate the gibbons. And it makes you think, where is the power, right, in this relationship? Because it seems through many different examples that the gibbons are drawing the boundaries. They are the ones saying, this is where our interaction ends. And I have very often seen people, if they don't want a banana, they don't want to accept something else from them, they will not take it. They will not come down as much as you call them, right? It's not that, okay, just because a food resource is there, they are going to come and take it. It's about drawing those lines, and showcasing what their boundaries are. Here, Kawa made it very clear that this kind of behavior is not okay, will not fly. This was one of the times we actually got it on video, but we also have other stories and observations. We have another story from somebody who said that they were doing the same thing, teasing, trying to get them closer, closer, not giving them the banana. And one gibbon came and just slapped her across the face, exactly like you would want to slap somebody across the face if they bothered you too much. And people did not have an issue with it because when it happened, they knew exactly why it happened and they were put in their place. And that kind of attitude is shared with people because they're talking about their relationships with gibbons with each other so much that mutually they all understand that ha ye nahi karna chahiye tha, that's why he hit me you know um, Another incident, like I was saying, there's a lot of electrification and oil mining in this area. And while in most of the areas where the gibbons live, again, because of the campaigning of the local people, they now have completely insulated cables and wires, and it has become an alternate movement substrate for the gibbons. So they brachiate, they have this special movement, right, where they move with their arms, which they would usually use for the trees. But there are many areas where there are canopy breaks, and instead of trees, there are cables. And so they often use the cables to move instead, because it's still safer than coming down onto the ground in those regions. And sometimes, even if there's a lot of trees and if they're higher up, they might even choose to use the cables because it's faster. But this is also an area that faces a lot of cyclones, a lot of torrential rain, and other kinds of climatic features. And generally, all of electrical work needs to be regularly maintained. So often there will be faults in insulation. And we've seen electrocutions happening to the gibbons often, sometimes minor, sometimes fatal. So this was one such incident, where this is Kawa here. So let me just show you. This is Olibda. So that video I showed you of them brachiating through the tea garden, that's his house. And here he's just sitting under his Rubabtenga tree. And here you can see Annu, this is Kawa here, hanging down low to take a banana from him. They're all, there's a huge amount of trust between this family and Olibda. And he has been looking at the gibbons since he was born, essentially. And his father also looked after them very carefully. And he's taken on a lot of those responsibilities for the caretaking of the gibbons in the landscape. And what happened one morning while we were also there is that Kawa sustained a really bad electrical shock because of one such insulation fault in the wire. And he was so badly electrocuted that he was almost paralyzed, was not able to move at all, and then wasn't very aware of his surroundings and not completely conscious. And so all of that, as soon as he heard, he came running from his house. It was very early in the morning, didn't even have time to put on his shirt, just came out running. And he was looking after him and giving him, he was massaging his limbs and arms, trying to restore mobility and circulation. Same kind of massage he gives his father, who has health issues and blood circulation problems. And so while all of this was happening, he was holding on to him on top of the
First
scooty.
time
And
Ishika
as
ଆସିଲେ
often happens, in
ତାପରେ
our
ଆମକୁ
country, a
କୌଣସି
huge
କୌଣସି
mob
ଗୋଟେ
had,
ସତ୍ୟ
not mob,
କହିଲା
but a huge crowd had gathered. And this was the point where Kawa
ତାପରେ
started regaining consciousness. And he was immediately defensive. He noticed the large crowd of people. He turned around. He turned around and he made a sign with his face, and he had an open mouth threat showcasing his canines, and he very clearly wanted to bite. And then he turned. It's not extremely clear in this video. This was one of the videos from the people who were recording what was happening. Uh, he turned, he noticed it was Olibda who was holding him, but he was ready to bite. But he stopped himself from biting. And when Olibda finally kept him down, he bit the scooter instead. So it's very interesting to look here, where there was that instinctive need to defend yourself, to want to escape this place that is stressful, where you've been through something that was physically and probably also emotionally traumatic for the gibbon, with his family looking on from right above, and to recognize somebody who has never harmed you holding you, and then choose to redirect that anger, right? So what does that tell us about agency in non-humans, or intentionality in them, and in the recognition and relationships that they share with people? So we've been trying to understand what this looks like through, of course, the use of non-human ethnographies that document these experiences using thick descriptions, looking at what their daily activities are like, and also through the analysis of people's own accounts. And this is a picture here to show you that people also celebrate the birthdays of gibbons here. And because they really look at them on a day-to-day basis, and they actually know exactly the days that they were born. So this was on 1st November, which is coming up soon, which is Twig's birthday. And this is from Twig's third birthday. Twig is going to be 5 this year. So yeah, just a few more days, you can wish Twig a happy birthday. But we also look at the accounts of people, through all of our conversations. What are they saying about agency? And I think that's very important, because in the same way in which we talk about vernacular ethologies, which is people's accounts of animal behavior through their own observations, in the same way, looking at agency through people's accounts and vernacular accounts of it as well is that it's all based on so many years of detailed observations of their behavior that we must stop and think about where is the truth in it, right? We cannot be dismissive of it. Something else that we have been doing, which I've been absolutely loving, was a bit of citizen science in this landscape called hololog. And this is a bit of a joke because holo is what they call the gibbons, and log in English is like the gibbon log to know what is happening on a day to day basis. But in that part of the Northeast, log is added as a suffix to everything. Like hum aadmi log hai, ye holo log hai, ye table log hai, even for inanimate objects. So that's what we're calling it. It's the holo log. But what's amazing here is that the participants are of many ages and many genders. And this is in one particular village of Borgaon, and this is where I was telling you a male from outside has come into the area and is now living with a family of gibbons. And this is something which is extremely extraordinary. It's something which you don't see documented elsewhere. Like I was saying, this is supposed to be a purely monogamous arrangement in a gibbon nuclear family. And it's not very clear why this other male is here. While he is trying to gain access to the female, there's a lot of interesting pushback. And now what's happening is we're observing matings that the female is mating with both the males, and there's an interesting three-way competition which is happening among the family. And whatever evidence we have of what happens when an external male enters a family, none of it has happened, and all kinds of other things have happened in this landscape. And so we were documenting them very closely. And from everything we had heard informally from other primatologists, from the local community, to know what had happened in such a situation before, the literature gave me absolutely no insight, unfortunately. It was very hard to know what might happen, but whatever clues we were getting said that something is going to happen very quickly. Whatever will happen will get resolved within a week or 10 days because there'll be tensions, there'll be competition, maybe there'll be a fight. Um, but this started happening on the 10th of April this year, and it's still going on. This mail is still here, and there's still new things unfolding every single day. So it's really baffling to us. What is this new social arrangement that they're living in, and what is this new reproductive strategy, even perhaps? And it's altered their days, their sociality, everything. So during the monsoon months, when we were not able to be there, we requested a lot of our local collaborators to keep an eye on these gibbons for us, and they were very happy to do so because they knew exactly what we were doing. They knew the gibbons very well. They could tell them apart, and they were also very invested in it because they were also concerned about their own gibbons and wanted to make sure nothing happens to them. And so this was an expert where this grandmother in the area, she said in Assamese, she said, "Tai moram kori asile," which is, and moram is a word which is used in many different contexts. It's used for love, it's used for affection. If I have a really lovely conversation with you, I can say that I felt moram. You can use it in many different contexts, but here she was basically reporting mating. And she used the word moram here for mating between them as well, which is just so beautiful. And it just tells you that there's so much beyond English when you look at vocabulary of how to describe what gibbons do. I'm just going to end in a couple of seconds. Um, yeah, so this is also something that I've been really enjoying. Maybe some of you who were at SECS got to see a little bit of this at one of the Art Corner stalls. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Shombita Modak, who is a fantastic illustrator, and we're just building out a board game and a bunch of illustrations and hand-drawn maps to create a strategy-based game based on the last 4 years of data of gibbon movement in the area, where we've illustrated an exact replica of the village areas along with the elements that exist in the landscape, and have showcased the exact tracks that the gibbons have taken on different days based on what we've observed to understand the risks and opportunities as this landscape provides. And also some of those double-edged swords, like I was telling you about the electrical wires, which could be good in some ways, it can also be really bad in some ways. So we've been having a great time doing exhibitions, artwork, and also now working on this. So hopefully in a few months, there'll be a board game based on all of this data to just help understand what is going on here a little bit better. Um, Also, just yesterday, this is a short film that some of my collaborators released. It's part of a longer project. There's a full-length documentary that's going to be out sometime next year. But this is a shorter 20-minute version of it, which talks a little bit more about what's happening with the gibbons in this landscape. Yeah, so I think I'm going to close by saying we need to make sure that we're not using people as the gold standard always to understand what is happening in the worlds of non-human beings, and try to understand them as is, because there could be a lot more happening beyond what we think is right and wrong, or the correct way in which a being is supposed to behave. And I like to come back to this quote from Cynthia Moss, which I had read when I was in school from a book of hers, where she said, I'm interested in them as elephants. Cynthia Moss works with elephants. Comparing elephants to people, I don't find it helpful. I find it much more interesting to understand an animal as itself. How does a bird like a crow, say with so small a brain, make the amazing decisions it makes? Comparing it to a 3-year-old child doesn't interest me. And I think all the Gibbons who have allowed me to spend time with them have just, shown this to me time and time again. So much more interesting to think of them as Gibbons and their lives as Gibbons. When you stop comparing them to people, it just opens up a whole new world of possibilities and interpretations and understanding, which we are otherwise stopping ourselves from having. Yes, I'm going to stop there. And just want to, I mean, everybody here, it requires a massive amount of gratitude from me. And all of this has been done in collaboration with some of the most beautiful apes, I will use as a collective term for everybody that I've had the opportunity of working with. So thank you.
Thanks, Ishika, for the really insightful talk and for sharing all these various stories of the from the modern human life worlds. And we really appreciate you taking the time to share these stories with us. I now invite the audience to ask you some questions, if that's all right. And there might
Absolutely.
be some online as well.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yes. Sashmita.
Fantastic work, and we've discussed this quite a few times. And so I don't have a question. I have a reflective question, yes. And the other one is a technicality. And I wouldn't have bothered had it not been a room filled with students, and which is the reason why I thought the technicality is important. So, first, the technicality perhaps. So I'm trained as an ecologist, but I'm also practicing ethnoprimatologist. I'm all for using an interdisciplinary lens, or for that matter, using mixed methods. But I think you need to be a bit more careful about saying how group scans wouldn't have been at all useful. So because it really depends on the questions that you're going to answer, right? So because I don't want to now go and teach research methods and have my students tell me, hey, you know what? Ishika came and said group scans are absolutely not useful, because it really depends on the questions that you are asking. The reflective part is, I remember you and I sitting on the A-tree terrace back in 2017, and you asking me, we have been having this conversation with Jayashri also. I think primatology needs to move a little forward, as in we spend far too much time just watching macaques. Do you think camera traps would be useful? And I had said, I don't think so. And I hope, and I'd really like to know, and I think I know what the answer is going to be, but I'd still like to hear from you. Do you now see how great it is to be in the field, and how a camera trap can never replace your eyes?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I'll respond to the first one. I definitely agree that group scans have a lot of merit, and I still do them. I think for the purpose of today and championing agency, which in that specific arena, it's hard to use group scan data to tell you too much. But all of this came after doing group scans and focal samples. So a lot of the work that I do has that first foundation. I think what we follow, thanks to Gene Altman, and what every primatologist does, it's a rite of passage and something that has a lot of value, and it gives you that hardcore, clear, foundation of what is the baseline ecology of a species, and it's definitely still very important. But I think, coming back to that conversation that we had on the terrace, no, I think even like talking about camera traps or any other equipment was all these desperate like searchings of how do we go beyond group scans, because we can ask the basic and the foundational questions in primatology through a lot of these methods. But what if we want to ask a little bit further, then what methods do we use? And I was also searching from the tool set I was currently given at that time, I think, and also from wanting to know what do they do at night, and I can't look at them at night, and can we put a camera up in the tree and stuff like that. So I fully agree, I would not give up my days following them and actually being in their presence for anything ever. I think even Rana says this, no? Like, I think primates are a very kind taxa because they allow us to see them every day, and I wouldn't give that up for anything. But hopefully, we found maybe one more tool to add on to group scans through this kind of qualitative ecological work, so that we can fill in some of those gaps, which I think we were feeling in that conversation. Yeah.
Is he able to hear you? Can you hear us? Kajal, can you hear us?
Yes,
You can
ma'am.
ask your question.
Yeah. So I'm also being a part of climatology. Like I'm doing my research in carbon accounting, like especially in coastal ecosystem. So therefore, I found it quite interesting, the behavior of human and animal in terms of climatology, storm, in terms of climate change that we're applying right now. So my question is not question, is it's more about like how we should know like climate has a negative impact on us, like we are in the climate crisis era. Therefore I would like to know, does this animal pattern, like not only the monkey you are telling about, is there any like taxonomy or you can say any other species which is exist in the ecosystem right now? So how does the climate change is making some disturbance between human and the animal interaction, in my opinion. So how and what aspect we can approach in terms of a solution mechanism?
Thanks so much for that. Honestly, I don't know. I think what we're seeing here is not so much climate change directly, but it may be a lot of symptoms of it, which include varied seasonality, a lot of extremely heavy monsoons in the area. We're seeing massive flooding in the wetlands, some of which has been historical, some of which, when it happens now, is very untimely and leads to people reconstructing a lot. And in addition to all of these things, there's a lot of new construction and concretization of natural floodplains in the area, places that would otherwise collect a lot of water and allow for more seepage. So there's a lot more flooding now that happens, which results in people having to move out of the area. And here we're seeing some signs of codependence between the gibbons and the people. And so, if people move out of this landscape with us before we are able to restore the landscape, it could be problematic for the gibbons. So, I don't know, this is very roundabout answer. But in terms of other biodiversity, like I was saying, there's also the pigtail macaques, the rhesus macaques. Cap langurs in this exact landscape have not been there for about 14 years, but they're there in neighboring forest areas like Dibru, Dehing Patkai, and Dibru Saikoa as well. So in all of these areas, I think if we're seeing more and more flooding come in, it's likely that either there's going to be a huge spike in construction or people will leave this area and go altogether. It's hard to say what the consequences of either would be, but beyond that, I really don't know much.
I have a reason. I mean, not.
So is
Am I
he done?
audible?
Yeah.
Am I audible? Am I
Yes,
audible?
yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I would like to addition one question regarding that. Like recently, one cyclone which has effect, Bay of Bengal, especially in Orissa and Bhitarkanika Wildlife Sanctuary. So can you do something, a mechanism, whether the, I mean, we have the shelter for human being, right? For evacuation and all those things. But what about shelter for wildlife species? That has a negative impact in terms of severe climate events like cyclone or maybe severe cyclone along with the flood.
Um, I think again here a lot of it has to do with ensuring that there's a little bit more um, conducive habitat for the biodiversity here that is not touched or not uh, reduced in size as much as it is, because I think a lot of the biodiversity here is quite accustomed to and has historically adapted to these very changing cycles that the northeast faces with the northeast monsoon especially. uh, but it is the more disturbed areas and where forests have become extremely fragmented, where they are facing trouble because there's not as much refugia. So earlier the lands were a little larger and there was enough region for them to, retreat back into if the uh, conditions closer to the river and floodplains got too extreme during cyclonic activity. But that refugia has really gone now. So I think a lot of it in the time we've been here has been pointing towards more restoration and more connectivity work. And I think that might be the first thing we need to do. Beyond that, it might not be my area of expertise at all. Uh, but I think, like, again, coming back to some of the interaction stuff, when I was working in Nicobar, a lot of the people told me that during the tsunami of 2004, which again was a very sudden freak incident and nobody was prepared for it, nobody knew something like that could even happen. But a lot of people say the macaques knew. And those who were awake at that time noticed that a lot of the macaques had moved further inland and to higher ground and went back inside away from the human settlements. And about half an hour later, when the tsunami hit, and so many people told me stuff like, if we see the monkeys moving in again, we'll know another tsunami is coming and we can follow them and, keep ourselves safe. So I think a lot of these kind of events, maybe there are some kind of internal mechanisms for biodiversity to safeguard themselves as long as we're not taking away all of the refugia. Yeah.
Thank
Hi, Ishika. I'm
Thank you.
Priyanka.
Hi.
So it was a very wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And since I belong to the region, I can really relate it. So it's not a question, but I think, yeah, I mean, you will know. So there was one Hoolock Gibbon called Kalia. So the
Yes,
name,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share the story and what actually the consequences of that action. So there was another Hoolock Gibbon. She was a female from I think nearby that region only.
Margarita.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she was also very close to the people. She used to come there every day, allo groom the people, the dogs, everyone, and people used to feed them. She used to sit nearby, like just like how the females of the house will sit. She also sit nearby and listen to them. So with like they grew a very close connection together. But one day what happened that I think the owner of the house or something, his kid took a catapult and then tried to hit Kalia, and she also got aggressive or something and she bit him. So the father of the kid, like without thinking much, he just hit a shovel on her head and she died. So, like when we look from the perspective of Gibbons, we know how they can feel or how they can relate or how they can see the actions of human beings. But we without being patient for a moment, we don't think about the consequences, and we don't think like even if we have been taking care of a particular animal for all throughout our life, just one action it takes to take the life away. So in that case, like I think it's a very big challenge when,
Mhm.
because when I saw your documentary yesterday, there also, while Mohit Khura has been taking care of everyone, he calls the forest department people, but they take time to bring
Yeah.
the medicines. They don't take actions,
Yes.
and many people in the villages, they will be cutting trees even if they know that there has been so much of habitat destruction. So in that case, I think it's a very challenging thing, and what
Yeah.
you are doing is very wonderful. I mean, if the gibbons are touching life, you are also touching many lives, both gibbons and the human beings. So yeah, that's what
Thank
I
you.
wanted to share.
Thanks, Priyanka, for bringing that up. I think that's an interesting example, what happened in Margarita with the other female Kalia. And I think there, again, like context is very important. And, there are different tellings of exactly what happened there. And I'm also at this point a little uncertain of exactly what transpired. But I think what you shared was fairly close to the reality, what may have been, what actually happened. there as well, I think that was not a space with a population of gibbons. It was one individual who was brought in when very young, which is why she was named Kalia, because she was brought in when she was so young that she was still black in color and had not yet gained her full coloration. And she was largely kept as a pet, and which is a whole other can of worms and everything that comes with it. And so she wasn't as free ranging, or she didn't have a complete, it wasn't as naturalized in that landscape. She was an orphan who was brought in and looked after almost like a pet. And so the kind of interactions she had there were very different. So stuff like, allo grooming of a human, these are things we've not seen happen here, because this whole concept of what is a domestic animal is also something that's come up a lot. And what is a pet, how much can you interact? And that's what also I meant by the boundaries that the gibbons are drawing, because we can very clearly see that they're still very much, wild. They're still doing everything that the gibbons I've seen in, say, Holongopar are doing. Very different. And there's this one additional interaction of being fed bananas by certain people. So, but as good as the intentions of the people here are, there are many other factors. Like even the chopping of trees, a lot of the people who are chopping the trees have to, because those are their trees, and during the lean months of the winter, they don't get daily wage jobs. They don't have many other the agricultural benefits, because nothing is growing with much at that time. It's not yet harvest season either. So they are forced to chop down the wood to sell the wood and get enough money to see them through the winter months. So sometimes loving the gibbons is not enough, right? If you need money and your one tree, which is 40 years old, can give you 80,000 rupees, which will feed your family until the harvest season, people will have to take that option. So it's also a matter of having enough replacement. What is happening here is there's no replacement in the landscape, and there's nothing new coming up to replace what could have been there for them. So we've also been experimenting with stuff like bamboo, because it grows very fast. It's great for the gibbons, great for the people, to have something, so there's not just huge gaps in space when trees are felled. So there's a lot to deal with. There are these spurious elements which you can't control, even oil mining and stuff like that. And since it's not a protected area, the forest department doesn't have a very strong presence here. So when something happens, you have to call them and they might come, because it's a scheduled species. But otherwise, there's no active patrolling, monitoring, or aid apart from what happens when people call them. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done in this area. Uh, but I feel very optimistic here, even with just 20 gibbons, because I have never worked in a space where I've seen such a pro conservation attitude from the people. Everyone themselves tells me what we ought to be doing. So, including the research and what we're planning for the conservation in the area, a lot of it is entirely driven by what the people there are saying. So, we have these meetings. We have an Amar Hulo Sangatan over there. So, all of the local collaborators and representatives, people who know of and care for the gibbons, we all sit together, and they help us set the priority for what research should be done, what conservation should be done. So we're trying to take that avenue, and we started now interacting with the department to get them to be a little more involved and a little more responsive and prompt. We have 2 3 point of contacts who are quicker to receive calls and just come immediately. So the incident in the documentary with Twig happened in 21, and this year when it happened with Kava, and that video I showed you, it was much more prompt. They were there within 20 minutes, which is just the amount of time it takes to come from their office. So we know that they came immediately. So some of these things have been working, and hopefully we can keep it going, but very early stages. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, the work is amazing. I just wanted to say that. And also, I think in Assam itself, another thing like this happened. Like there were greater adjacent storks, and they also had a close relationship with people. Not exactly close. At first, people used to think of them as repulsive since they were carrion feeders, and
Right.
they built their house, they built their nests everywhere. But they were also critically endangered, and then a researcher mobilized the people of that area to see them with pride instead, and that the Hargila army story. But also I wanted to ask, this gives like mobilizing people in order to like conserve critically endangered species really a viable option, like in case of the gibbons and the adjacent storks, or is it just a case to case thing?
I don't know, yeah. I think it's hard to generalize because every community is so different. I mean, even if you just talk about Upper Assam, I mean, I'm sure you also know this, right? You go 5 kilometers in any direction, you're working with a different community, and the traditions are different, the rituals are different, the relationship with the animals are different. And even in places where there are slightly more animistic cultures, or where you have a lot of tradition that includes certain biodiversity elements, it won't be for every single biodiversity species, right? It might not be for every dragonfly or every plant. It might be for one specific animal. So it's a little hard to say here. I think, like I was saying, a lot of it has been directed by the community. So I didn't go in with an agenda to convince the community that gibbons are important and to conserve them. They already believed it. For the first 2.5 years that I was here, I was just a neutral observer. And, while I was a part of people's days, and, we were very much um, living our days together, and I was participating in different activities, but I was not giving any gyan. I was not saying that you should do this, you should do that. But over time, now I realize I'm an important stakeholder as well in the landscape. And so now we sit together to make some decisions to figure out what we can or cannot do, or what might work, what might not work. And people also know that, okay, we need to know this about the gibbons. Can you and your team go do some research and tell us this thing about the gibbons, right? So it's nice to have that kind of dialogue, and a lot of this already existed with the community, and that way I'm very lucky. And which is also why I feel like, I don't want to write it off as just, okay, 20 gibbons, it's not worth it. And honestly, I've spoken to a lot of people from the conservation and research field who have told me this. Like they'll sit through the talk and say, all this is great, but it's not worth it. Why are you killing yourself for 20 gibbons? Just move on, or take these 20 gibbons, put them somewhere else. But literally every conversation I've had with people, and even during the days where we did a few more structured interviews, we would have questions about how just how people would feel if the gibbons are not in the landscape, either if they were removed, or if they died out, or they were not able to live on for many years. And everybody said that it would be extremely distressing in this landscape to not have gibbons. So people very much want the gibbons to be there, and they want them to continue being there. So there is a huge push to kind of help push that forward and make sure that they're not lost from here. So I would definitely say it is a case by case thing. I think in the Northeast, there are many examples of where this kind of work, like the Hargila is one. There's also the Amur Falcon, which was another huge story where it was more of an agenda driven engagement with the community, which has now led to this whole festival and the stopping of hunting. Um, so I don't know. I think it is a little case to case, but we do need to be very cautious of the ethics involved, and not play God, not toy with, just using the convenient parts of someone's religion to say convince, conserve something. I think very often we don't give a lot of local communities enough credit. I think they're extremely rich with knowledge. They're able to connect with us if we share our research and findings, and explain to them what we know about a species and why something needs to be conserved and why not. And so I think honesty, transparency, even if you go in with an agenda, would be great, because it's, yeah.
Oh, and I have one more question, if it's all right.
Yeah. I
Can
can-
we close the thing and you can ask her later?
Yes.
Is that fine? Thanks, Ishika. This was
Thank you
really
so
wonderful.
much.
Thank you for making the time
Thank
for
you.
this.
I know I had one small activity planned, but then I realized we were going overboard. But we can always
Of
some
course.
other time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.